Welcome to the Love in Action Podcast, the show that explores all the ways you can evolve into the best version of yourself as a leader. I'm your host, executive coach, speaker, and author, Marcel Shwantes. I believe that when we show up with our full humanity to work and lead from a place of love and care and inclusion, it will make a radical difference in your leadership, your business, and your bottom line. This is a show about love as a leadership and business strategy. Let's do this.
Hey, before we get rolling, I want to remind you that my Substack platform has been launched and people are streaming in to take advantage of all the content that I'm offering. Long form articles straight from my Inc. magazine column. You'll get an exclusive community where you can share your thoughts, comment, ask me questions, and engage me in discussions, and really contribute your idea. It's a community. I'm also dropping my leadership tips of the week, and that comes in video and audio form. But the most exciting part of this exclusive community that I'm building on Substack is the green room feature. Okay, this is a place where I get to extend the conversation on every episode of the Love in Action podcast with these global experts that I speak with. So the green room is where I offer you, my listeners, exclusive access to join in these private conversations with my guests. So think of it like an after-event backstage pass. So some of it will be pre-recorded and other times it'll be a live discussion, but it's only available to subscribers. So after today's show, head on over to Substack. I'll make sure that the link to it is in the show notes. All right, we're going to be talking today about a topic we've been covered in the past, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. So despite DEI being a strategic imperative and a real need everywhere, so many leaders struggle with how to make DEI effective, how to integrate it into their business strategies. And not only that, but how and when to hold people accountable in their organizations to make sure that these strategies are following through. And a lot of times leaders and managers think that adding DEI means, adding more work to their already full plates. So I decided to bring in some DEI experts to show leaders, to show people managers, and those who are really passionate about building an inclusive, equitable culture of belonging, that this work can be accomplished with little small actions. We're going to be calling these small actions small pebbles that we can drop daily. And, pebbles create ripples. And in these ripples, we hope generate waves of positive change. And that's the whole idea of today's show, is to have our guests teach us what kind of daily actions, what kind of small pebbles to drop in to create these ripples. So my guests today are Eddie Pate and Jonathan Stutz. They're going to join me shortly. Eddie and Jonathan are two leadership entrepreneurs who wrote a book called Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders, a guide to building a culture of belonging. So in their book, the authors highlight 7 practical ways for leading inclusively and how to foster a strong sense of belonging for everyone. Dr. Eddie Pate spent 20 years leading DEI efforts in some of the largest companies, including Amazon, Starbucks, and Microsoft. He earned his PhD in sociology, focusing on comparative race and ethnic relations, stratification, and social psychology. Jonathan Stutz is the founder and president of Global Diversity Partners. He has over 25 years experience leading global DEI efforts, also with Amazon and Microsoft. Jonathan earned his MBA from City University of Seattle and his BA in political science from the University of Washington. So let's dive in. Here is my conversation with Eddie Pate and Jonathan Stutz. All right, gentlemen, great to have you here finally. Welcome to the Love in Action podcast.
Thank you, Marcel. It's Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Since there are two of you, the question is going to be really for both. So we'll take turns. We start this way. You ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
What's your story? What is your story? And I'll start with you, Eddie.
All right. Thank you. I think I'll answer that question in a series of kind of moments in my life that have led me to, I think, this podcast really quickly. I think one of the first ones, honestly, that's my story is I'm biracial and being born half black, half white. My mom was white, blue-eyed, German from Nita Fischbach, and my dad was dark black, man from Tennessee, and he met her when he was stationed in Germany. Okay. And the reason that's significant is I was born at a time when in the United States, in many of the states, it was illegal for them to be married. So that has a way of setting up your life and your lived experiences that start directing you in the direction that you end up. So that's one of the things that I've experienced. And then throughout my childhood and actually throughout my working career too, I just had moments where you clearly realize what happened, and oftentimes in negative ways was because, again, of your identity, who you are, or at least who people think you are. So, so I've had a number of those moments. And as I like to talk about, that set me on a path of running towards fairness. Right. And really wanting to, help people, get through these kinds of moments. Another really kind of off the beaten path kind of, stopping point in my journey is in college, I was an athlete and I excelled at football. And I'm in my school's Hall of Fame. I was an All-American, all that kind of stuff.
Where'd you go?
But I went to Humboldt State University in Northern California.
Yeah.
And but the significance to this is in my senior year, I ended up at a 2-year stint or 3-year stint of having 2 ACL tears. Oof. And so all of a sudden, back in the late 80s, when you have ACL tears, it has a way of redirecting your career. And I tore my ACL in the Chargers camp in the late 80s. And that essentially sent me down a different path other than the one that I thought I was going to do. And I ended up going back and getting a master's degree in sociology. And so that was another inflection point for me. I was married, I had a kid, which was another inflection point. And then at that point, we decided to make it really crazy and go to grad school with having a 6-month-old kid. And that was another, kind of stopping point that led me in this direction. And it was I went to the University of Washington doctoral program in sociology, again, for comparative race and ethnic relations and social psych. So that led me into this direction. And again, working towards, helping people deal with what lived experiences they've had around race and gender and, oppression and all these things. Got my doctorate. And then the last inflection point that I'll say that led me to this path is I had a choice between academia and the corporate space. And I had kind of an interesting experience in an interview to join a social work team. And then I had another really interesting engagement where I had a chance to talk to the head of diversity at Microsoft, a gentleman named Santiago Rodriguez. And I was so empowered, Marcel, by his leadership and his passion and energy for ID&E and talking about how he can make a difference in people's lives and how he thought I had that. And it just shot me in the direction of a essentially 24-year career of doing inclusion, diversity, and equity. And then ultimately writing a book with Jonathan on the daily practices of inclusive leaders. So that's kind of my journey stops to answer your question.
Wow. Before I go to Jonathan, can I do a quick sidebar? I'm a big NFL fan. So when you say you were at Chargers camp, I'm thinking, were you a walk-on?
No, I was signed.
You're signed?
I was signed. So just right after the draft, I wasn't drafted again because of the knee injuries that people were worried about. But I had 3 different teams knocking on my door, and I had to choose with my agent. And when you have Dan Fouts and Kellen Winslow and all, Charlie Joyner and these kind of people in camp, and you're a wide receiver. So the choice was pretty simple, but unfortunately, I just, whatever my ACLs, whatever reason. And I think, I do believe in fate and those kinds of things. And I think it happened because this is where I needed to be.
Yeah, I was going to drop the same names that you dropped because I was a Chargers fan when they were in San Diego back in the day. The Fouts era, right? With all those amazing receivers, right? And he was racking up 4,000 yards a season because of those receivers, right? And so that shows that our age, because I think we're about the same age. If we remember Dan Fouts and Charlie Joyner,
a long time ago.
Because I was going to say that's before Junior Seau era and the Drew Brees early on. Right. So okay, all right, that was a nice sidebar for our sports fans. There you go. Jonathan, what's your story?
Yeah, thank you. So I was born in Toronto, Canada, which is considered one of the most diverse cities in the world. And at a very young age, my family moved to Atlanta, Georgia, during the height of the civil rights movement. And that experience of seeing discrimination, hate, anti-Semitism, racism, had a profound effect on me as a young kid. My family was very open and progressive. I'm Jewish, and I was raised in the philosophy of tikkun olam, which means to repair the world. You come into the world, and your responsibility is to work to make it a better place before you leave. And so that was ingrained in me. And as a kid, this ties into football a little bit too, going to Pop Warner football practice in my carpooling in my friends' parents' cars, hearing profane language, bigotry, the N-word, just horrible things, and that just wasn't something I was accustomed to or knew, and that stuck with me. And so fast forward to a sales career, we moved to Seattle, and my parents divorced, moved to Seattle, and through my career, I had the opportunity. I was in sales for a temporary help company, actually, and my customers were federal contractors, and they were asking for my help in diversifying their workforce to help with their good faith efforts for affirmative action. And that was super interesting because I didn't know a whole lot about it at that point in my career. And so I started talking to my other customers, and the East Side, where I was working with Microsoft and Nintendo and Safeco Life Insurance, and then the customer was Siemens AG. And they all were having a similar problem because the East Side at that time was pretty white and homogeneous. And so I started working with community-based organizations on the Seattle side that had that diversity of Black and brown people and just people of difference. And we got them together, and we created a group of HR and recruiting folks from the East Side with those community-based organizations, and we called it the East Side Diversity Task Force. And it was through that I got some visibility in the community. I had my picture taken in Diversity Business News with Jesse Jackson. He was in town.
Wow.
And it was crazy. And the next year, by the way, I went back and had him sign the photograph. His son's name's Jonathan too, so he knew how to spell it. That was viewed, but Microsoft spotted that, and they recruited me in to be a diversity outreach strategist for them. I really, at that point, found my calling, so to speak, my purpose. I was passionate about the work. I believed in it. I grew up in a family that was dedicated to social justice and equity, and it really helped me find that this is really what I meant to do. And so I ended up spending 19 years at Microsoft, not just in the diversity team, but I moved on to a team doing what's called geopolitical strategy, which was ensuring that the products were politically, culturally, and geographically appropriate in different markets around the world. So that gave me that international, multicultural knowledge and experience and a passion for what we call cultural competency. And that really, kind of set me off. And then left Amazon or left Microsoft, did a short stint at Zulily, a flash sale retailer, and then I was recruited out of there for Amazon. Was not having a great time my first year there, and was introduced to Eddie, and came on to his team he was building out. I think I was his second or third hire, and we built out a huge team of 20 people doing diversity work across a million employees in the operations group. And I had 4 huge global organizations myself. So that's my story, and it's led to Eddie and I, after we kind of what we call soft retired, and reached out to a friend of mine and who had written 3 books, Bill Price, Frictionless Organization, his latest book. And he helped us get connected with Barrett Kohler and we Neil Mallet. And so we ended up writing this book together, which came out just a couple of months ago.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And thanks for connecting the dots, by the way, about how you two met, because I meant to ask that. And by the way, I mean, hearing your stories, I can tell you we are kindred spirits, because there's purpose, mission behind what we're doing. I do everything I do as a speaker, coach, writer, whatever, author, because I want to lessen suffering in the workplace, and really flip the script on servant leadership, on leadership, by bringing more servant leadership approaches.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, guys. So let's get into the surface. Speaking of the book, Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders. Why this book? There are so many of books like this. Why this book? Why now?
When you think about this discipline of inclusion, diversity, and equity, and we'll talk later about why we call it ID&E versus other combinations of letters. But there's a lot of books out there on why this is important, the strategy, at a high level, what to do. And there's some great books, and there's some great people doing this work and writing. There's a lot of great content to advance the discipline. But what we found in doing our research is there really isn't a book out there today that helps leaders understand what to do on a day-to-day basis. What are the behaviors they need to exhibit day in and day out? So that's how we approach the book. The book is organized, the second half of the book, in this life cycle of the employee. So you can literally pick up the book as you're doing recruiting or hiring or talent development, talent management, or promotions. And we give you specific, easy, intentional steps that you can implement into work you're already doing. Mm-hmm. So we don't believe that exists today. And so we think that's really a help for leaders. And we say inclusive leadership is leadership. So this really helps leaders build that culture of high performance and building, highly effective teams where everybody wins.
Yeah. What I would add, Marcel, just really quickly to that is we did our own research, but on top of the fact that throughout both of our careers, when we were dealing directly with executives and leaders, you could just picture us sitting down with some leader and having her turn to us and say, look, I get all this. I know my accountabilities. I know the business case rationale is super strong. I know why we're doing this as an organization. But, come on, Eddie, or come on, Jonathan, help me out. What is it that I can do the minute you leave my office to actually have an impact on whether someone feels like they belong, whether it's an inclusive organization, whether we're doing the right kind of process or structure or policy to again, create the kind of environment we want that feels welcoming. So it's been years of constantly hearing that and then developing these tools along the way that then culminates in our book. A lot of what you see in the book are not things where we're sitting there and brainstorming what we can say and write. These are lived experiences both of us had in our jobs that we've been collecting as stories for years that ultimately ended up being those daily practices that we've highlighted across the life cycle. So that just gives you a little bit of the practical piece of kind of how we as I loved how you say, practical love, right? That's how we led to our practical love in the workplace. Yeah,
I love it. It is chock full of practical tips, daily practical. We'll get into that in a minute. So let's bring this whole DEI versus IDE. Even I get confused now, but okay. Why ID&E? Why should the I come first?
For sure. So when you think about your home and you're inviting guests into your home, you want to make it a warm, welcoming, safe place. You might even, bake some cookies, make the house smell good, or your favorite dish. People come in and they can really be themselves. They feel, they really are connected to you and they feel they belong. So that's not unlike your company and any organization. When you have people join your organization, you want them to be able to feel like this is a place that they're safe, they're welcome, and they feel connected to you. So this is why we intentionally prioritize the I, because this is really about inclusion and everybody feeling included. And that's everybody. That includes white men, right? And we'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But this is so important because if you focus on just hiring, a diversity of folks, and you don't focus on creating this culture of belonging with inclusive leadership, they're going to come right in the front door and they're going to go right out the back door. We call that a leaky bucket. And so you want to focus on creating an environment where people want to stay, they feel they can achieve their goals and aspirations, and feel they belong. And so that's why we intentionally focus on the I. And in fact, It's interesting that even just this last couple of weeks, the Society for Human Resource Management has decided to also intentionally prioritize the I. There's some controversy there with them as they remove the E, and we can talk about that a little bit too. They remove the equity piece in their description. They're calling it inclusion and diversity. But they've in fact have come around to kind of what we've been talking about for years, which is prioritizing the I for inclusion.
Yeah, so it's really a big I, and then everything else follows from that I, right? You have a place that's more diverse, you have a more equitable organization, people belong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Marcel, I think the piece is I like to talk about the E being the end game. And it's a way that we surround the diverse talent, the inclusive pieces that Jonathan so eloquently spoke about, and then the equity piece, which is the end game of where we want to get to. I often, when I develop strategies at these companies over the years, I've often talked about doing diversity work's about 30% of what we do, but doing inclusion and equity work's about 60% of what we should be doing as an organization, with the final 10% being that assessment piece to make sure we're doing this correctly and if we need to. So it's not just a verbal way of saying it. It was a very practical way of how we did our work. Diversity is 30%, inclusion 60%, 10% is the assessment piece. Wow. So it drove how we actually constructed, strategy and engaged with our clients.
Okay, to honor this conversation, we're going to call it ID&E for the rest of the episode. Okay,
for the rest of your life, Marcel, right there, rest of your life.
It'll stick. All right, so Eddie, let me ask you this. Sure. A lot of people that advocate for ID&E believe that the narrative has been hijacked with a lot of misinformation. So can you tell us what, in your eyes, and Jonathan, you can jump in here too, what are those false narratives?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And it is completely timely because the people in our industry, the work that we're doing, just the philosophy of inclusion, diversity, and equity is being challenged. And I don't even, people will say there's pushback on a DEI or ID&E. I don't think it's pushback. It's literally attack. It is, folks who want to completely erase this because those false narratives. One of the most important pieces that I think people are missing in misunderstanding or this false narrative of what ID&E is the definition of what it's about. It's not about Black people and women. It's not about people of color and women only, or people with disabilities. ID&E is not and if you do it right, is not a zero-sum game. Everyone benefits. The pie gets bigger. And as Jonathan alluded to a few moments ago, and white is not neutral. So when you talk about ID&E or DE&I, we're not excluding white people. They're part of the conversation because being white and male in this country, that's just two dimensions. And there may be other parts of Marcel, if you self-identify as a white man, there may be other pieces to your educational, background, your cultural background, languages you speak, your family status, your veteran status, all these things that may make you and I have more in common, even though I'm African American, than you and Jonathan, two white men, right?
Yeah.
So it is not about creating advantage for Black and brown people and people we identify as underestimated or underrepresented. It is about leveraging the differences that create creativity and innovation for companies, for our lived experiences. So that's one of the biggest fallacies. And that's what folks who are attacking it want people on it who are listening and everyone in our society to think that in some way doing DE&I is a way of replacing white people in our society, at least, because in other countries it may be gender's the dominant issue, or cultural differences or religious differences. But here in our country, it gets defined as race, right? And so we're just trying to make people understand that no, ID&E is a very broad, a broad collection of dimensions that matter. So that's one of the ways that this whole dialogue has been hijacked. And I think that's a really crucial one for your audience to understand. Jonathan, what else would you add?
Yeah, this is, if you think about leaders and leadership in this country, a high percentage of the leadership in our country, whether it's you look at the Senate, you look at the companies, you look at nonprofit organizations, the dominant culture still to this day is in the high 80s, low 90 percentile, is white and male.
Right.
And so this is the dominant culture, and the organizations that we work with and your listeners work with, they want to succeed. They want to create high performance teams, highly effective teams. And in order to do that, to go after, these really tough problems we have in society today, look at, artificial intelligence. We're dealing with privacy issues, security issues. You have bad actors there misusing the technology. These are new problems. And we've seen this before, right? With the internet, is that you have to have all hands on deck. You need everybody at the table globally, because the cultural differences as well. And so to solve these tough problems, they call them adaptive learning problems, where no one person has the answer. You need to have everybody's perspective and ideas and solutions. And the thing is if you're part of the dominant culture, it's a lot easier to be seen, heard, and you're valued and understood because you're part of that dominant culture, and you kind of fit in easier, if you will. Well, the challenge is that if you want to create that really inclusive and culture of belonging, leaders need to be super cognizant of those that are on the perimeter, right? Those that are not part of the dominant culture. So if you are a person of color, if you are the only woman on the team, the only person with a disability, the only veteran, a religious minority potentially, you're going to have it's just naturally, it's harder to feel like you fit in and that you belong. And so leaders need to be super cognizant of that, and have, you're running a meeting and you have your agenda to go through, but you also have to have your antenna up to make sure you're hearing the perspectives of those that maybe are not being heard, and making sure that you're really pulling everybody in and that everybody feels safe to share their ideas and opinions. So that's a huge part of it. And then the other piece of it is, I know we talked in the green room a little bit about situations where you have two people, a white man and a black man, let's say, and the word is the black man got hired for the job because he was black. Well, first off, nobody wants to get hired because of their race or their gender. You want to get hired because you have the greatest knowledge, skills, and abilities, and you can outperform the other candidates. So that just is what I call malpractice when that happens. You have people, well, there's a lot of great diversity practitioners out there today. The high majority of them are, professional, and they do a great job. But the challenge is there isn't any one person or any organization really creating a certification or a license to do this work. It's not like a physician or a lawyer or an accountant where you have to pass a standardized exam in a high level to do this work, or even master a body of knowledge to do this work. So you can have a percentage of folks that are implementing ID&E incorrectly. And I think that has also given us a bad name, so to speak, when you have that, and that can be sensationalized in the press.
But I do want to jump in really quickly on this too. Look, to take it beyond the bad practice kind of thing, I think it's equally important to understand that oftentimes there is a false narrative that happens when someone is a woman or a person of color or from one of these, underestimated groups, when they're hired, to make it sound as if they were hired because of that. But when you're in this country, at least, if you're oftentimes white and you're hired, no one ever questions that. No one ever says. And so I think it's really important to realize that it's not that the person being hired that happens to be a woman or a person of color or an intersection of a Black woman or someone who's LGBTQ or something. And I think the majority of the cases, people are hired because they are what is needed for that role. They close a gap you're trying to close, and that people throw up this sense that they were this, affirmative action hire, or it was reverse discrimination. I wasn't hired because this person was put into this role because they're this. No, actually, they were put into this role because they were the most qualified for this particular situation. And the situation could be, what does our customer base look like? What are the gaps on our team right now? We're all men. We don't have any women on the team yet. 30% of our clientele are women. So we need that perspective to help us make sure that we are truly seeing what is experiencing. So Marcel, I think that's a really important distinction to make. It is not simply errors people are making, but people are consciously making intentional choices where the value of diversity is a real superordinate characteristic that is being put into this role. And so we need to hire these folks. So that's the one thing. The other really quick thing, and then I'll be quiet, is I want to make sure that I point something else out in the first part of my answer, just very quickly. I alluded to, white and being white and male. Being white male is just two dimensions of diversity, and they're part of the dialogue and discussion. But in our country, I do want to put the caveat out that ID&E work it's very important to also think about the advantages that white men do have in most situations in the workforce within the United States that we need to address and deal with. So even though being white and male doesn't make you the target of our diversity efforts at all, you're part of the solution and you're part of the inclusive nature. We do have to deal with the reality that white men often do have advantages, have certain privileges that people who are not in that category, they don't have. So it's a dual complexity that we have to deal with. You're part of the solution, yet we need to have you acknowledge your privilege and your advantages so we can address them and deal with them, and then get to this notion of integrated inclusion and equity. I just want to make sure that I point out that nuance, because I don't want the audience to think that we don't see the reality of race and gender dynamics in the workplace.
Right. So I want to go a little bit on the limb, because when I hear false narratives, my first reaction or instinct is, well, don't listen to false narratives. So I think that the false narratives, tell me if I'm right, come from extreme right or left views, depending on, your persuasion, what you're listening to, what your narrative is, right? And I'm wondering if that's being politicized. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think so. I think that people tend to listen to information that confirms their own beliefs. It's not often that they'll sit down and have a conversation with somebody that is on the political spectrum, very different from theirs. I was reading and actually listened to another podcast where they were talking about Stephen Breyer, the Supreme Court Justice, and he talked about the importance of understanding other people's perspectives, and the way to move them to help them understand your perspective is not through telling them, but through listening and asking questions. And by asking them, why do they believe what they believe, and continuing to ask that, so you really get to understand their core beliefs. And through your questions, you potentially move them to understand your perspective better, versus just kind of dictating what you think they should believe.
Yeah, and I think this is another, again, every one of these questions, I think we can spend like an hour if we wanted to talking about each of them, but I know you don't want that. But I think there are a couple other things that I would add to what Jonathan said, and I think are really important. In sociology perspective, in social psychology, there's this whole dynamic of in-group versus out-group. And we all talk about that. You're in one particular in-group, and you really go to extreme lengths to maintain your tie to the in-group. And what's really interesting, Marcel, for the point you're making is, even in situations where you really vehemently disagree with your in-group about a particular topic, there's so much pressure to maintain your in-group status that you don't say anything. So I would bet on both sides of this political divide, there are whole groups of people who don't like what's being said, but don't feel they have agency or the will to push back against this, because then they'll be ostracized. And what do? Sometimes you find yourself in the middle. You're not in the in group and you're not in the out group, and you're just here. And people don't like to be in that situation. And one last thing, it's a little bit of sociology, ID&E geeking out. Confirmation bias is probably one of the most prevalent and powerful biases that people have, which is we like to take in and hear the things that confirm what we believe. And when we hear something that goes counter to what we believe, we do what's called subtyping. And we say, oh, that's an exception. Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't think women are great leaders and superior. Oh, oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, but she was elected, the prime minister of Australia. Oh, that's just, it's a one-off. That doesn't really happen. So people subtype information to confirm what they believe to be true. And that is it's just plain human characteristics. We all do it.
Yeah. They minimize it. They downplay it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to bring the recognition of the voices in the middle as that's the majority voice, instead of giving megaphones to those on the extreme polar opposite ends, which seems is what is happening right now, and it's causing us to be divisive. Divisive. Yeah. All right. So speaking of ID&E geeking out, let's do a little bit of that right now and get into your book.
Sounds good.
I was thinking of part 1 first, and maybe touch on some of those insights. You got, I think, 7 insights in your book, and some of it really kind of forces you to hold up the mirror. It did me. And so let's touch on a few of those. Okay, I think most of us are familiar with concepts like stereotyping and unconscious bias, but not so much with some of the others. Like, for example, micro-advantages and micro-inequities. That's the one I wanted to throw out for me, but feel free to, what do you think about, what exactly is that? And then toss in a couple others that you feel are really crucial for inclusive.
Yeah. So I'll run with this one to start off. So what you're pointing to is the 2IL model, that is the inclusive leadership model that we introduced in the book. And this is something that I've developed over the years in the leadership roles I've had with ID&E. And again, they're insights. And the beauty of these is you think about your podcast, and you think about, practical love in the workplace and how leaders show up, and how in empathy and vulnerability really become characteristics of great leadership. The IL model helps inform you as leaders where you are in engagements, 1-to-1, 1-to-few, 1-to-many, 1-to-thousands, right? So you understand how who you are impacts the engagement in that particular moment. And that's super important to keep in mind. And each one of these pieces, you mentioned stereotypes and unconscious bias, are things that we need to be aware of so that we can actually lead others and understand what biases have. So like you said, that's really clear. The whole notion of micro-inequities and micro-advantages are these little subtle actions or statements or comments that we make that can significantly influence a way a person feels, like how if they feel like they belong. These are often subtle comments or actions that are targeted towards people who are underestimated, who are racial minorities or LGBTQ or women in situations, as Jonathan said earlier, people in situations that are onlys. They're the only veteran on the team. They're only person with disability on the team. They're only neurodivergent person on the team. And someone makes a slight comment that is oftentimes unintentional, but has a way of impacting a person negatively. And what's really fascinating about micro-inequities, and I'm glad you pointed this one out, is that micro-inequities and micro-advantages have expanded, right? People are starting to realize it's not just micro-inequities, but it's micro-invalidations. As a way that people should be thinking about. It's micro-vulnerabilities, right? So there are ways that people are being triggered. There are microaggressions that are teased out when they are purposefully done to make someone feel as if they're one down, like yelling at a person with their window down, driving by with their music on, and using a racial slur or saying something like that could be a form of microaggression. And it's the thing that your audience should understand is that these are often subtle, unintentional, but the impact of them are profound, because what we find in this work is that if you think about the imagery of having a cup in your hand, and you have every day you get a micro inequity or a micro advantage, and it just slowly but surely fills your cup until it expands and overflows. And when that happens, the person who's the target of multiple microaggressions or inequities become disengaged, become dissatisfied, become an attrition statistic, and they leave the company, become quiet and muted. And here's one of the worst outcomes of this. They become so quiet and muted and not feeling like they can contribute to anyone in the organization that the talent that you brought them in to contribute is muted and goes away. So you're less creative and innovative. So that's the beauty of some of the kinds of things that we're trying to teach leaders, is that you have to understand how you unintentionally use micro inequities or micro advantages in the workplace, and then how other people around you do, so that you can point them out and help your organization be healthier. So it's one of them. And the last one that I'll talk about, and not to get too long-winded, let Jonathan jump in too, is I actually like the simplicity of the platinum rule, right? And when you think about engaging with folks and making them feel like they belong, the golden rule, as people have, at least in our country, and it's pretty globally understood, is treat people how you would like to be treated. So I should treat you, Marcel, how I would want to be treated myself. But actually what we want people to do is adhere to the platinum rule, which means treat Marcel how Marcel wants to be treated, not how I want to be. And once you have that conceptual, just mind-blowing moment for yourself, you can see how you have to engage with people where they come from, centering them, and they feel like you understand them, you hear them, you're culturally competent, you understand what makes them tick, and it's not always the same thing that you want. So that's a long-winded response of the 2IL model, but it's a series of insights that I think you need to have if you want to be an inclusive leader.
So yeah, I'll just add that I think, popping to kind of like a 30,000 foot level, what's different about our model and about our book in this way, and is that in this work, there's a hyper focus on unconscious bias or implicit bias. And that's certainly super important as well. But there are other dimensions or insights, as we call them in the book. There's 7 insights. And leaders that are inclusive leaders need to have and this is about lifelong learning, because this isn't about checking a box or taking one class or taking one trip. This is about a lifelong journey to continue to grow your acumen in these 7 insights. And they're cultural competency, which is key as we're dealing with much more of a global workforce and working with people in our own country with microcultures, even here in the US or North America. There's ethnocentrism, which is about people judging, a culture based upon their values and, having a more narrow view. And stereotypes you mentioned, which we know about. And then you guys discussed micro advantages and equities, the platinum rule. And then the 7th insight is part of our overall model that we talk about, a metaphor. There's 2 primarily. This one it's in the 7 insights, is about being a tempered radical. And being a tempered radical is based on some great work that we've been very fortunate to work with the author and know, Deborah Meyerson, Stanford University professor, who wrote the book Tempered Radicals, How to Drive Change Without Causing Trouble. And the idea is you want to rock the boat, you want to drive change, but you don't want to rock it so hard that you knock yourself out of the boat, right? You want everybody in the boat. We need everybody contributing to go forward. We need everybody rowing in the same direction, right? There are times when something is done so inappropriate or offensive that you need to knock some people out of the boat. And sometimes an environment so toxic, you need to knock yourself out of the boat. But for the most part, you're looking at creating this culture where you keep your seat at the table, where you're heard, and you can really drive change by being this tempered radical. So those are the 7 insights of inclusive leadership. And the book, our chapter on wisdom, daily wisdom, goes through the 7 insights in detail for folks. And then we actually have videos attached with QR codes in the book that take you to videos of us talking about a lot of these topics in more detail.
Let me put closure to microadvantages and inequities for a second here. I'm going to read how you guys defined it, okay? Because I want to drive the point home for our audience. So here's microadvantages: subtle actions or messages that give people a leg up or indicate they belong simply because they are part of the majority in group. That's pretty powerful stuff, guys, because if I'm not in that majority in group, how should I perceive that notion? Is it that the person in the in group that's commanding these subtle actions that I may be experiencing every day? Is it that they don't know? Is it that they're not aware of it, or is it intentional on their part? What's going on inside the mind of the person that is creating these micro advantages?
There's a lot of, they call them blind spots. There may be a lack of awareness.
Okay.
Because when you're in a culture and it's the dominant culture, they talk about it like, if I asked you, Marcel, like, how's the air you're breathing right now? You'd say, what air? Or ask a fish, how's the water, right? I mean, it's just part of the culture. It's part, they don't even think about it. So sometimes it's very helpful for leaders that are part of the dominant culture and not seeing that people that are not part of the dominant culture or that outgroup are having a very different experience. So what we've done is, and we talk about this, we highlight Carletta Uten in the beginning of the chapter on heart. And she talks about, she was a leader that I supported in her like 8,000 employees and, fantastic leader. She's now with the Apollo Management Group as a partner. And she and I worked together at Amazon. And what she did is she actually, at my recommendation, was to sit down with a group of Black employees and hear, just sit back and listen and hear what they're experiencing at Amazon, what they were experiencing in the workforce. And it drove her to tears. She literally broke down and cried. And because she just didn't have that awareness before that of what these folks were experiencing and how different their work experience was from her and from what she thought everyone was experiencing. And she called it in the book, she talks about it being really a life-changing experience for her as a leader and manager.
Yeah.
So that's an example of how this in-group, out-group can play. And when folks are part of the in-group and they have the opportunity to experience or hear, they can develop that empathy and her being vulnerable enough to show how it affected her, really, raised her up in the minds of everyone in the team because of her compassion.
Yeah, and Marcel, I think, getting very specific about your question about how micro advantages happen in the workplace, if you think about what we've talked about in terms of, stereotypes, ethnocentrism, all these kinds of things that the IL model points out to people, right? Oftentimes, micro advantages are, like you said, subtle and unintended, but the outcome and the impact of them are profound. So here's an example of micro advantage. Marcel, why don't you take the leadership on this? I want you present at the all company meeting for us, because I know you always do it how I like it. You always, come strong in your presentation. So why don't you present to our senior executives in our whole company? And the person may not intend it, but that becomes a micro advantage because the person is picking you because you are similar to them. You talk like they do. You have the same ideas. You approach work the way that you do, and you have this prototype of what excellent looks like. And on the side here, you have women and people of color, people from different backgrounds or cultures or different languages, who don't have the same visibility that you created for this one person. And the outcome of this one person may be now people recognize who they are. Maybe a senior leader recognizes them and offers them a job where they have a chance for a promotion, or they get, to interviewed, but, because of their discussion or whatever. You see what happens is one little subtle decision on giving someone an advantage because they remind you of who you are, but you don't even recognize you're doing it. That's the outcome.
Yeah.
And if you think about, if you were to give someone who's different or someone who doesn't normally have visibility that opportunity, this is what we talk about in our book, dropping a pebble. You drop that pebble, you'll cause a ripple where now you have this, maybe it's an indigenous woman who is first time ever presenting in front of the organization. She nails the presentation. people suddenly recognize her and see her in a different light. And now you are getting other people in the audience who have opportunities to then create visibility for others to say, God, I love that. I want to do that as well. So that's the simplistic, nuanced beauty of our book, and how we talk about dropping a pebble, causing a ripple, dropping a pebble, causing a ripple. And that gives you a very practical insight example of what a micro advantage looks like, the advantages it causes and the disadvantage it creates for other folks who aren't in that particular in-group. So
I'm so ready to drop some pebbles, guys, because the second part of your book, it's so full of these pebbles that will create these ripples that we hopefully will be these waves that we'll ride on. And one of those is really when we think about an ID&E strategy, so many companies center it around the hiring process, right? Talent acquisition. And what they don't even train their leaders on how to do it properly. So talk us through, and the reason I chose that is because that's the one that you start with is attraction. So what are some key steps? How do we do it right?
Well, I'll give you some specific daily practices that we recommend.
Perfect.
One of them is this idea of having diverse interview panels. And the idea is that, and this is easy to do in an organization, where when you look at the panel of folks that are interviewing candidates, because you want to make the best decision, so you want to have a variety of perspectives and views on the candidates. So ensuring that you have diversity in your candidate pool, so you don't have a group think, you get a different perspective of folks, and get those different opinions out on the table. And so that's one advantage of it, is that you make a better decision. But the other side of the table is the candidate. The candidate is getting a number of messages. They're seeing that this company values diversity, that they are an inclusive environment, that they have a diversity of folks on the panel. And if they are a person that is in what we were just talking about, an outgroup, they're a person that's not part of the dominant culture, and they see somebody that looks like them on the panel, they're going to feel a greater connection, that there's people like me at this organization, and they're in positions of power making decisions on hiring. So that's an easy practice to put into place, and maybe more challenging for a smaller company, but still you can be cognizant of bringing in folks that have that diversity of perspective and opinion.
You'll love it.
Another quick one is on the actual recruiting side. We recommend this idea of candidate slating, so that you cast your nets wide, you do the outreach work, similar to what I was talking about at the very top of the call, where I created the Eastside Diversity Network, where you're reaching out, you're creating connections and trust with organizations that represent the diversity of people that mirror your workforce, right? You want to have a workforce that mirrors your customers and the community in which you live, work, and play, we say. So creating that broad net that you're casting, and then bringing in a diversity of candidates, and then ensuring that when you get to that interview panel, that you have a candidate pool that has at least two people of difference, so people that are outside the dominant culture. So it could be two Black people, it could be two people with disabilities, it could be two veterans. But the idea is that, and Harvard Business Review did studies on this and showed that if you just bring in one, that tokenistic kind of approach, the chances of that person getting hired are close to nil. So to really create a competitive environment and not tokenistic, you actually want to have at least two candidates on that panel of candidates that are that bring that diversity in. So those are a couple easy ones that you need to be more thoughtful, and maybe the candidate slating of actually having, you're always going to hire the best candidate for the job, but having that diversity of candidates is something that needs to be, maybe it's a little bigger pebble, but it's definitely one that it can make a huge difference.
And then Marcel, the one that I'll add to those, and I love those two examples. I think the closest thing to a silver bullet, right, is an inclusive hiring. And we talk about inclusive leadership training, but there's also something called inclusive hiring training, so that you're taking all these, not just recruiters, but sourcers, people who are scheduling the events, hiring managers who are developing the strategy, all these various people who are involved with talent acquisition organization that actually have this customer facing, contact with the customer. You have to take them through inclusive hiring training. And again, to Jonathan's point, that might be a slightly bigger pebble, but the ripple is profound. If you teach people to that an interview, for example, is not just some one way activity. It's an interaction.
Yeah.
You have perceptions and biases about the candidate. The candidate has perceptions and biases about the organization. And you have to recognize that your ethnocentrism, your stereotypes, your micro-inequities, all these things come to play in those moments of interaction. So if you understand that and you can mitigate them or put them to your advantage to really make someone feel comfortable and like they belong, you'll find out the best thing about the candidate. Yeah. Inclusive hiring, I think, is every talent acquisition organization on this planet should make sure people are doing it, so that when you do things like candidate slating and stuff like that, you understand why you're doing candidate slating, how best to practically involve it. So
Marcel,
you're
right.
Marcel, it ties in beautifully to one of your prior podcasts where you talked about Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. And this is where being really critically thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, instead of just moving quickly and saying, "Oh, we got to fill that job. We need to fill, get a button seat." So way up cycle before you even start, doing the recruiting for a job. Sitting down, the hiring manager sitting down with the recruiter and the sourcer, and looking at the team and thinking of it as a bit of a puzzle. And you ask yourself, what are the missing skills, abilities, knowledge, perspectives we're missing on the team? Because you don't want all the pieces of the puzzle to be the same. You really want to have that beautiful mosaic. So being thoughtful and slowing down and thinking about what is it that we're missing on the team from all different perspectives, right? Absolutely. So you don't have this homogeneous team can really pay off downwind when you're have that candidate pool in front of you and you're making hiring decisions.
Okay. So I realized inclusive hiring might have been a little bigger than the pebble, probably a throwing rock. So I'm going to shrink that rock down to a real pebble. How about everyday pebbles? Because here's the thing, we all have meetings. So how do we turn a meeting into a more inclusive meeting? Maybe even talk about inclusive brainstorming.
So here's a couple very daily kind of things that you're talking about, right? One of the ones we talk about is introducing the notion of a pause button. And so we've all been in meetings or situations where you hear something or you see something, and maybe you're in a situation where there are power dynamics in the room, like the VP's there and there are directors, and you are maybe a junior manager, a middle manager, and you hear something that is inappropriate or you think is wrong, or you have information to add, and you don't say anything because there's so much pressure. So the pause button creates a process that everyone understands, a shared understanding that if you see something or hear something that you think we need to slow down on and discuss, you literally say, "Hey, I want to hit the pause button." And there are a series of questions you can ask or things that you bring up that, okay, hey, in that last example, I think we're missing something and here's what it is. Or when I look at that data, we're about to go through it, every single person on that list who's going to be exited out of the company are Latino or Hispanic or Latino, right? So shouldn't we talk about that? And so it's this agreed upon process that takes the pressure off of being a junior in a role, of slowing down conversations, and it's just an agreed upon process. Hit the pause button. That simple add to talent management meetings, talent acquisition meetings, to promotion discussions, to whatever, attrition discussions and who's going to get exited, will help an organization be way more inclusive because you'll slow down, you'll ask the right questions, you'll point out some of the obvious. And here's the real cool thing is you'll create a speak up culture, which is exactly what you want, which leads to creativity and innovation and better decisions. So pause button is super important. So I know you only want a couple, so that's the one I like to point out. Jonathan, what daily practice do you like?
One of the ones that I really like is the inclusive one-to-one meetings, because you were specifically asking Marcel about meetings. And the one-to-one meeting, we kind of take it for granted and pass it off as like, well, this is a meeting to talk about status on projects or, how somebody's doing in their job. What that last one is part of it. The one-to-one meeting is a huge opportunity to get to know your people at a deeper level, to connect with them. And to create that speak up culture, that culture where people feel safe to speak up, to say what they're thinking, to share their ideas and opinions. If they feel the manager has their back and they've got I've got your back, you've got my back culture, that can happen over time in the one-to-one meeting. And there's a bunch of tips we give in the book about what to do. Some of them are verbal, some of them are nonverbal or just behaviors. One of them is just like show up on time. I have a client that I'm working with right now where everyone shows up to meetings like 4 or 5 minutes ahead of the meeting start time. And for me, coming from the Amazons and the Microsofts, that was shocking. We're used to 5-10 minutes late. And that was just the norm. Everybody in this company consistently shows up early to meetings. And that, if you show up early to a one-on-one or you're there when the person comes to your office or wherever you're meeting, that sends a message that they're a priority, they're important. And having it regularly scheduled, like every week for maybe a half hour or every 2 weeks, to make sure it's a recurring meeting. And you're not spending time just on status. You're getting to know the person at the individual level, what's important to them, what are their goals and aspirations, having a career development discussion. Are they getting the opportunities? And then getting back to heart, the leader being vulnerable and sharing what's going on in their lives and being open so that level of compassion can come out and employees get the message that, wow, my leader's sharing really personal stuff about themselves and needing my support. That tells me the message is that this is a place where I can be myself and I can share with my leader what's going on in my life, because not everyone can show up. No one, in fact, can show up 100% every day. So we need grace and we need people who are going to work with us with our things that are going on. People are going through divorces. They may have a parent they've lost. There may be a sick family member in some way, might have gotten a ticket on the way to work. So just being able to be open and create connection with your employees. And we talk about this, quickly, I'll finish the diversity tree, and the visible dimensions of who people are in the leaves and the branches. But in the roots of the tree are all these hidden attributes and characteristics of individuals. It's getting to know the people at the deeper level and finding out really, who they are and what makes them tick. And that creates connection and can create that heart that we want in our leaders and in our employees.
Yeah. Yeah. Gentlemen, how about this? We got a lot of CEOs that listen to the show. So speak to the high-level leader, the decision maker. Of all the things we've talked about so far, how do I begin my journey of making my organization more inclusive?
So I'll start on this one then. I think there are a couple of things that you need to do as a CEO, as a C-suite person, or any leader for that matter. There are a couple of things that I really strongly believe. You have to be committed to owning the material. And what I mean by owning the material is you have to reflect on who you are as a human. What are your intersections? What's your cultural background? How do you show up? How does your race play a factor in what you're doing? So you have to acknowledge and be real about who you are. What languages do you speak? So in other words, how do you own ID&E from a philosophical, personal, and knowledge base, right? So I encourage leaders to even, listen to podcasts, read books. We give references and suggestions for people. Just have experiences interacting with people who are different and learn from them. So owning the material is very important so that you understand the dynamics of it. And the other thing that I think is really important for senior leaders to understand right away, and you'll see every single training I do or strategy I've created over the years, I always have a component called a shared understanding. So for a particular organization, how they define inclusion, diversity, equity, intersectionality, all these different things, how they manifest in their organizations may be different across organizations, right, industries, by, where you are in the world. If you're in Japan versus Dusseldorf versus wherever, your notion of what ID&E is for you will be different and in fact, within the United States, notions of ID&E are different based on regional differences or company type. So it behooves you as a senior leader to create a shared understanding for exactly how your organization within the industries that it is in, the markets that it's in, should be defined and discussed. Because when you don't do that, your jump off points are so random, and you have chances for misunderstandings, for anger, for false information or perceptions. Start out with the shared understanding. So those are two suggestions that I would make: is own the material, and create a shared understanding for your organization. And I guess I'll add one other quick one too, is I think you have to be very clear that you are not going to drive this yourself. ID&E is not a top-down endeavor that's how this works. It's top-down, middle out, bottom up. So you have to not only hold yourself accountable, but you need to hold others accountable and communicate that accountability, reward people when they're successful, be willing to have hard conversations and intentional conversations when they're either not participating or making mistakes, and not in a calling out kind of fashion, but a calling in kind of fashion where it becomes a learning situation for people to bring them on board. So I think this level of accountability that a leader has for not making this their organization or assigning it to a leader in the one, hero in the organization, but making it clear that this is of such business value to us as an organization that we all have to get involved. That's the kind of mindset and things that I would say.
Yeah.
I would say that it's I'll say it a little bit differently, because when leaders, like yourself, Marcel, when you come to us and say, what are the one or two things that the CEOs, the C-suite folks can do? Well, we tell them it's really not one or two big things that somebody can do and to add to their already full plates. It's really, and this is the core of the book, is that it's really lots of little things done 2 or 3 times a week. It's weaving it into the culture of the company. How you think about maybe safety, and how a lot of companies have embraced safety in their work, and how they've just made it part of their corporate culture. The same's true about inclusion, diversity, and equity. It's a business issue. It's a business strategy to win. And this is the message of the book, is that it's lots of little things, and it can be done easily and intentionally throughout the employee life cycle. It's little things like taking SMART goals that we've heard for, 30 or 40 years, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. We've changed them to SMARTIE goals. We add inclusion and equity. As you're setting your goals, put them through the lens of, are they inclusive? Are they equitable? And getting feedback from people in your employee resource groups, from people that are on the perimeters of the organization as far as the dominant culture, and hear how they feel it's going to impact them. It's just lots of little things, a lot of the elements we talked about today. And it can be as easy as walking down the hallway and, nodding to somebody or saying hello. We call it feeling seen, and how that's important to people to feel like that they fit in, they're part of the organization. It can just be a nod sometimes. So just lots of little things to help people create this inclusive culture of belonging.
All right, guys. Well, we wind down to our last 2 questions of the episode, as we do with every guest. And then I encourage those of you not yet subscribed to my Substack to head on over, because Jonathan, Eddie, and I are going to continue the conversation in the green room, which is only available exclusively to my Substack subscribers. So I'll make sure that the link to it is in the show notes, so you can click on it right now and head on over there. Okay, gentlemen, the first one is the love question. So I'm a high-level leader, and I want to adopt a more inclusive approach to leading and culture development, but speak to it from a love standpoint, a leading with love. How do I do it? How do I lead with more practical, actionable love every day?
Sure. I would say bring more humanity into your role. Leaders oftentimes will portray themselves as this hard shell that's impenetrable, and protect themselves. And I think the true leader who emanates love is one who sheds that hard shell and lets people in and see who they are as an individual. And so demonstrating that vulnerability, and then being empathetic to people and what they're dealing with and how they're walking through life, understanding them and listening. We talk about in the book about leading with your ears. So I think leading with your ears is a huge aspect of hearing different perspectives, hearing people's lived experiences that may be very different from your own is a way to demonstrate heart. And then we call it, an accomplice in the book, but I heard a great one, and I think it might have been from your podcast about the action ally. Was that I think that was you guys, right? I think you talked about the action ally, and I love that because that's very similar to an accomplice, and that's somebody who actually takes action and stands up for somebody. So showing heart can be somebody who is an advocate in that meeting, is an ally, and demonstrates care for somebody and when they're getting interrupted or their ideas being stolen or they're not included in that lunch or not being, just taken care of, right? So that's what I would say.
Oh yeah, I love the allyship. There's a lot of love in that as well. All right, Eddie.
Yeah, no, I love Jonathan's answer. In fact, I probably would have said something similar, but I think because I think it's that important, and I think it really ties into your whole love, practical love kind of approach to leadership, empathy, vulnerability. I think it's beautifully stated. I think what I would add to that then is I think there's nothing more powerful than embracing, I guess, the characteristics and guiding principles of an inclusive leader. And that sounds kind of rote and that kind of thing, but I think if you really think about what we talked about today, all these insights, if leaders do honestly adopt those and they become authentically culturally competent, authentically understand ethnocentrism, authentically understand what it means to be a tempered radical, I think there is no more powerful tool for a leader to really have that kind of love practical impact on an organization.
Beautiful. All right, guys, close us out. What's that one thing? What can we take home with us that's going to make us a more inclusive leader? I'll start with Jonathan.
I would talk about realizing this is a journey and not a destination, that inclusive leadership is leadership. It's not any different. It's creating this high-performing organization is really embracing all of what's in the book. And what we can give people is our website, inclusivepebbles.com, has a plethora of resources, of videos of Eddie and I talking about these topics in detail on a couch, just very relaxed and comfortable, plus lots of content that we share in our training, different videos. And so that can really help folks as a takeaway. There's a whole lot of resources there to help them in addition to what they'll get from reading the book.
And for me, I think people need to realize the oft maligned soft skills of leadership that's exactly what leaders should be doing and embracing. So I knowing that you asked this question, I've been thinking a lot about it. I want you should embrace them. You should enable them. You should model them, because the positive impact of these soft skills that we've been alluding to the entire time is the positive impacts could be profound in terms of engagement, satisfaction, retention, brand, lived experiences, joy, right? In the workplace, the joy you get out of work, your lived experience. And something else I know it's important to you, psychological safety, right? If you embrace the soft skills and create that kind of environment where people feel psychologically safe, it's super empowering. So leaders, embrace soft skills, because they're not something you should discard for these hard leadership skills. That's exactly what defines what beautiful, great leadership looks like.
Well, Marcel, didn't you say in one of our recent podcasts that these soft skills are actually hard to develop? The soft skills are hard. And I think we want to be fair to folks that this is not like a straight line from A to B. This is a bit of it because it's a journey to learn these what we're calling soft skills. It is building a new muscle for a lot of folks. And so practicing, being graceful with yourself to realize you're not going to get it right the first time, that it's a journey, keep working at it. You're going to make mistakes. That's okay. But practicing it, getting better, again, a daily practice can make a huge impact.
Yeah, I do say that a lot, but I have to attribute that to Tom Peters. He's the one that said soft is really hard. Soft is really hard. Right. And I mean, in my coaching business, I see it. I stumble into that all the time. Empathy, compassion, vulnerability, transparency, respect. All of those things that are required for us to be effective as leaders on the job are the hardest things to pull off on a daily basis. And that's those are the things that are going to make you more successful.
But that's where the courage comes in. Marcel, that's where the courage comes in and the heart to do this. I think Tom Peters and everyone's right, but I also don't want to. I have to push back and just say it doesn't have to be hard.
Right.
It just doesn't. You just have to find what way is comfortable for you to do it, and think about the impact you can have if you show some caring, if you show some empathy, and it doesn't have to drive everything you do every day. Because there are different levels that people can do.
Yeah.
They're different. That kind of thing. It doesn't have to be that hard. Just try. You can do this.
Beautiful. We'll end right there. So if people want to get a hold of you guys, connect with you, and find out more about you, where can they go? Eddie.
So like Jonathan said, inclusivepebbles.com would be a great place because we have a lot of information on there, contact information. You can go to eddiepate-speaking.com, that's my business website. We both have our own consulting companies. So eddiepate-speaking.com, and there's a way to contact me, my background information, my media kit, everything. It will have all the information where you can get a hold of me on Instagram, Facebook, those kinds of things. So eddiepate-speaking.com and inclusivepebbles.com. Reach out, people. I'd love it.
Great. Yeah. And I'm at globaldiversitypartners.net. That's my business website. So feel free to reach out to me there. Eddie and I often will do some work together, but we also work individually as well. And but you can, at inclusivepebbles.com, you can see our bios and connect with us to our individual websites if that's easier for folks to remember.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. So the book, again, right there, it's called Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders. And you can keep the conversation, guys, going on Substack. Look for the link in my show notes and head on over there right now and comment there, because you're allowed to comment and like and ask questions. So if you have something to say or add to the discussion, please go and ask questions. And also, you can watch this very episode on YouTube and look for all that information on my website, marcelshwantes.com. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Love in Action podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, subscribe, and leave us a review. Until next time, don't forget, the future of leadership is love in action. Believe it, practice it, and watch your leadership and business flourish.